So it's a pleasure to be here in Vitoria. And what perhaps justifies this crossover between philosophy and philology is the fact that we're talking about Owen Barfield, who, as you may know, is one of the Inklings and had very wide interests, not only in the history of words, of language, but also in philosophical and anthropological themes. So just to give you a very brief overview of the aims that I have for this very brief communication, I'd just like to talk about the understanding that Barfield had about myth. So I'd like to basically devote this whole presentation to try to get it right, because it's a topic that is quite complex and usually it's passed over. And I'd like to connect this to the understanding that Barfield has of poetic activity, so how creativity, poetic creativity, is grounded in this understanding of myth that Barfield has. And perhaps talking a little bit more about my broader research, I'd like to end, if I have the time, talking about how this relates to other debates that are taking place now in philosophy, in cognitive science, about the relationship between language and thought. So just a very brief words about Barfield. As you probably know, or perhaps you don't know, but he's sometimes called the first and the last of the Inklings. So this literary group, we just heard about C.S. Lewis. Also J.R.R. Tolkien is another member of the Inklings. And as you can see from the dates, Owen Barfield outlived both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and his friendship with C.S. Lewis when they were both undergraduates in Oxford was very important for the development of the Inklings, of this literary group. So he's sometimes called the first and the last of the Inklings. Just to give you a very overarching idea of what Barfield's interests and philosophy is, his key concept is this thing called the evolution of consciousness. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but basically Barfield had this idea that from the study of the history of language and literature, one can get an idea that the consciousness of humankind has developed through history, and we can actually trace this through philological evidence, and that's the interesting and original aspect of his thought. So he would tell us things like poetry affects consciousness. He will speak of an expansion of consciousness that is affected by poetry. He would also say that language, etymology, has captured this history of consciousness of mankind. So if we do etymology and we go back to the origins of languages, we can actually see a very different worldview present in the earliest literatures. And finally, myth is this key element in this whole theory, because myths are, ancient myth particularly, are these instantiations of these ideas that Barfield has about consciousness. So myth will be, the analysis of myth will be a basis for his own theory. So like I say, if you read Barfield, I don't know if you've ever had any time trying to read Barfield, and usually he's quite complex. He likes to throw in lots of names and references to not just philologists, but also philosophy, anthropology is usually quite varied, and it's not particularly easy, but he's usually mentioned also in passing when people talk about J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis. Barfield's theories of myth, which are very influential for the whole of the Inklings, are mentioned, but I think they deserve separate examination. So that's the whole point, like I said, of this talk. And like I said, although the terminology is sometimes complex and he likes to throw in philosophy, he, unlike C.S. Lewis, he remained pretty much constant throughout his life in his ideas. He says in a letter to C.S. Lewis that although C.S. Lewis had a conversion, religious conversion, and a number of intellectual conversions, apart from that one, Barfield had maintain his main ideas throughout his career. So let's just dive into this theory that Barfield has about ancient myth. And he begins in the book Poetic Diction, which is what he wrote as a PhD thesis in Oxford. He tells us about a contradiction between two observations. When we talk about ancient language, ancient poetry, or myth, ancient myth, we see two explanations that don't seem to fit well, or very well. He calls these the aesthetic judgment and the philological judgment. This is poetic diction, as I say. The aesthetic judgment, he tells us, is when the poet and the critic find language growing more and more poetic as they trace it back into the past. So if we do any etymology, if we read Homer, for example, and we go back to the Odyssey or the Iliad, we will see that words have this very poetic or metaphorical character, right? And he gives us different examples. So just to mention a few, in History in English Words, which is another famous work that he wrote, trying to show this value of etymology for the study of consciousness, he gives examples of panic or serial, and he will give all the words like understand, and I'll explain what I mean. Panic for us has a perfectly mental meaning, we will say, or psychic meaning, right? It refers to an emotion, an inner state, whereas serial is a material word. It refers to something, to an object, to a concrete material thing. And he would say, if we go back in etymology, in etymological history, we will realize that panic cannot be understood apart from the Greek god Pan, who is this god of the flocks, of the herds, right? So when we see a flock of sheep, for example, panicking, literally for the ancients, this would mean that the flock is possessed by the spirit of the god Pan. Another example would be cereal. Cereal is, like I said, a very perfectly normal thing that maybe you had for breakfast, but actually cereal, etymologically speaking, means something that comes from the goddess Ceres, so the Roman goddess Ceres, which would be the equivalent of Demeter. And Ceres, well, you had maybe a divine breakfast because you had the fruits of this Roman goddess, right? And so on and so forth. So he gives other examples like understand. He says we use understand in this abstract intellectual sense, but we don't mean any longer to stand under something, or the word projection, to project, meaning to throw forward, etc. Right? There's loads of verbs that don't have these literal meaning, but we can trace it back in the history of language. So we go, this is the first judgment, okay? We go from a very metaphorical period, which we can see in early literature, to today's meanings, which are fragmented into what we can call the mental and the material, right? So movement from metaphorical to the fragmented meanings in today's languages. This is a common statement that you would have heard not just from Barfield but from many philologists. Language is a tissue of dead, of faded or dead metaphors, right? So we can trace these developments. The philological judgment runs contrary to this one, and this is the contradiction that Barfield is calling our attention to. So he says the Locke-Müller-Franz way of thinking sees the beginnings of language in a series of monosyllabic roots with simple perceptual references. So Locke-Müller-Franz refers to these three authors. He mentions many of them, but he's referring to John Locke, the English philosopher, Max Müller, who was a very influential mythologist in the 19th century, and who usually comes up in discussions with Tolkien and Barfield and C.S. Lewis as well about myth, and Anatole France, who is a writer. And basically, these authors had very much this idea in vogue in the 19th century, that if we study the origins of language, we come to a period where what we see is very simple roots, so one-syllable roots, that have meanings that are material, what we could say material, right? So just to give some examples, this supposedly primitive language would have words like shine, stone, or tree, which are perfectly material, and they're very general. And then as time passes, the speakers of these languages would have used these material references in a metaphoric way. They would have started combining them, forming longer words, more complex words, and they would have developed these metaphors that we see in Homer, for example. So this movement goes from prehistory, so what's before our written literatures, to ancient myth, right? And it tells us the opposite movement. It's telling us that we start with simple words that are material, and they just mean literally those material reference. So the stone means the stone, shine means shine, right, tree, and so forth. And then we go to this very poetic language that we find in Homer, right? So we find these two contrary movements. You're following more or less what I'm saying, right? We have the movement from ancient myth, which is metaphorical, to contemporary languages, which are fragmented, and at the same time, this judgment that we go from very simple literal meanings, to metaphorical meanings. What Barfield wants to do here, and this is very interesting, is to challenge what he calls sometimes the naturalistic assumption or naturalistic explanation of myth. And this is very influential in British intellectual life throughout the 19th century and also in the 20th century, which is this idea, this interpretation of evolution as the idea that mind arises out of a material process of evolution, right? So we have matter. There's a time in the past where there's only matter, and then through a process of evolution, we have sentient beings, conscious beings like human beings. And he wants to challenge this idea. You can see this assumption already in the philological judgment. So the idea that primitive peoples would begin by talking about material things only. They wouldn't have any consciousness, any inner life inside, right, we could say. So let's see more or less how this is articulated. So he's criticizing the way of resolving, the common way of resolving this contradiction. The way that it works for the authors that Barfield is going to criticize is to say the following, right? So we begin in prehistoric time with this idea of the simple roots, monosyllabic roots, with simple general perceptual meanings. And then we end up in modern language with fragmented meanings, the material, the mental, the inner, the outer. What happens in between, and these are the theories that were very influential in Barfield's time about myth, and he wants to criticize them, are usually two kinds of explanations that Barfield is going to mention. He's going to talk about Max Müller's idea of a metaphorical period. So Max Müller, who was lecturing in Oxford about mythology and philology, tells us that how is it possible that we begin with this simple roots originally, and then we end up with Homer, right? With very metaphorical language in ancient poetry and myth. Well, he says there's a race of poets that comes about at some point in ancient history and begin using these simple roots that existed in original language in a completely metaphorical way, non-literal way, right? So they would apply a word like shine. Think, for example, shine in Homer. Shine is applied not only to fire or to the sun, but it's also applied to joy, to the emotions, it's applied to the intelligence, it's applied to even dogs in the Iliad, for example. There's a very mysterious reference to shining dogs, and philologists are not very sure what that means, but it's applied in funny ways, right, we would say. So Max Müller has this idea that at some point, poets come about and poets develop these metaphorical language, and then people forget that these are metaphors, and people begin to take mythology seriously, literally. So they would think that if originally I perceive that, it gets dark in winter and it's very bright in summer, I developed the myth of Persephone in Greek mythology to explain why it gets dark in winter. But this originally is just a mere explanation, right? Metaphors. But then people forget about this and they take mythology literally. So this is why Max Müller will think that mythology is decadent. Mythology is a disease of language because it's this forgetfulness of the original lack of metaphoric meaning in language. There's another theory that Barfield is going to criticize, very present, and we will probably hear about it in this week, which is animism. Edward Tyler, who is an anthropologist, very influential in British life as well, who would say, well, we begin with this material world and then we just project our own inner life onto natural phenomena. So we have emotions, we have consciousness, and we think that a rock or a tree has consciousness. And this is how mythology comes about, right, through projection. This will be continued in Jungian psychoanalysis as well. Barfield comments on this. We can go back to that later if you want. Barfield tells us in Saving the Appearances, before speech was invented, primitive man lived in a world, except for details, very much like ours. His next step was to invent simple words for the simple things he saw about him, trees and animals, the sun and the moon, and so forth. And then, when his reason had evolved, he found he needed words in which to express his inner life. He used these simple words again, but this time as metaphors. Herbert Spencer and Max Müller went further than this and added that later on, men made the mistake of taking their own metaphors literally. And that this was the origin of mythology. Mythology, said Müller, is a disease of language, like I said. So if you're following more or less so far, we see this theory that is developed, very influential in the 19th century, about how do we explain ancient myth. And Barfield is going to overturn this theory, right? We're going to see the arguments that Barfield gives now against everything that I have explained. The first observation, and these observations come from philology, so that you see the power, right, the impact that philological studies can have. He would tell us ancient myths are concrete, not general. And I explain what he means by that, because it's a very obscure distinction. But we have said that in this area of primitive language, we have simple roots that have material references, right? Like tree, light, stone, for example. And he says, actually, if you look at ancient languages, and also if you look at primitive peoples, inverted commas, in today, so from anthropology, both philology, looking at ancient languages, but also anthropology, looking at non-Western, exotic, we might say, languages today, we see that they don't actually have these general words like tree. They have words for gum tree or coconut tree, but they don't have the word for tree. The word for tree is an abstraction, a generalization that we make from specific words. Another example he gives, very interesting one, is the word to cut. So cut is perfectly material for us, so you can cut a piece of paper, a film, for example. But he says there's no general word cut in ancient Greek. You have words for cutting the flesh for a sacrifice, for example. This is very specific, right? And these generalizations only come about later. So what is he saying here? Well, he's telling us that when we go back to the earliest literatures that we have, we don't find general meanings, but very specific instances where both the material and the mental are beginning to be blurred a little bit. So this will be his second point, which is what he says, what he calls by saying that ancient meanings are unitary, they're not metaphors. And I explain what I mean. Today, if we take a word like ancient Greek pneuma, and we say that pneuma means spirit, breath, or wind, we are inclined to think that these are metaphors. So we have different entities. So spirit will be one mental or non-material entity or reality. And then we have breath and wind, which are material, mechanic, perfectly physical, we would say. And then a poet might want to make a metaphor connecting these two realities, or like a poet might want to use the word shine and apply it to emotion or to intelligence. This would be a metaphor. But he's telling us, actually, in ancient language, we don't find metaphor. This is not metaphor. This is not connecting two things that were separate before. What we actually find is a unitary experience, a single thing that is both at the same time material and mental. To use words that perhaps are not adequate, but this distinction between the subjective and the objective is actually not present. We project it onto these ancient myths and ancient language. So when, for example, in Greek, someone would say pneuma, they're actually not meaning two things. It's not like in a dictionary where you find a word and then you have meaning one, meaning two, meaning three. Actually, this is one single entity directly perceived by ancient peoples. This is Barfield's key idea, right? So what for us are two distinct meanings, material and mental, like spirit and wind. For ancient Greeks who use the word pneuma, it meant the same thing. So meaning that the wind is alive, the wind is spiritual, a spiritual reality. So he comes to his famous idea of ancient semantic unity. Right? It's this idea that prior to our distinctions, our modern distinctions in modern ages, right? In modern age, between material, immaterial, inner, outer, subjective, objective, and so on and so forth, we have in myth this earlier way of looking at the world that is completely alien to us and is very difficult to recover, even though Barfield's attempt was to show how we can go back to something similar to it. So, to recap a little bit these ideas from Barfield, what he's telling us is that ancient peoples, and this is the strong statement, right? Ancient peoples directly perceived such aspects of reality as a unity, which we now can only reimagine as creative connection. So, ancient peoples would experience entities, realities like the wind, a tree, or a stone, not just as material things, as physical things, but as things that are both material and mental. We might want to say that we're alive. So he would say that in ancient myth, we have a vision of natural phenomena as, like I say, alive, spiritual, or divine. And this is his criticism to Jungian psychoanalysis. He would say that Jungian psychoanalysis is actually a step in the right direction because it retrieves the essence of how insight relates to outward phenomena, but he says that it can't explain the nature content of ancient myth, because in Jungian psychoanalysis we will always talk about the realm of the subjective, but we don't actually say much about why are these explanations of natural phenomena, not just of internal psychological phenomena, right? So he would tell us, how do we go back to it? Well, poetry, metaphor making, imagination are a current means to regain this vision. So the value of poetry, and this is Barfield's key idea, the value of poetry is not just causing aesthetic pleasure. So it's not just a subjective feeling. We accept that, yes, we read poetry and it makes us experience all sorts of emotions. But he says something more. He says that poetry causes wisdom. Why? Because poetry helps us see again those connections in reality that we no longer perceive, because our view of reality is fragmented. If we read ancient myth, if we read ancient poetry, we're able to recover this view of reality as one, as a unity, right? So metaphors here, for Barfield, metaphor is not just a nice occurrence. It's not something nice that occurs to you when you connect to entities that have nothing to do. He says that there's a true kind of metaphor, a true poetry, can allow us to see the original internal connection of reality. We can go back to this in the questions if you want. And just to conclude, I'll read this passage from Poetic Diction. He says, "The language of primitive men reports these realities as direct perceptual experience. The speaker has observed a unity and is not therefore himself conscious of a relation. But we, in the development of consciousness, have lost the power to see this one as one. Now it is the language of the poets, insofar as they create true metaphors, which must restore this unity conceptually after it has been lost from perception. Thus, the before unapprehended relationships of which Shelley spoke are in a sense forgotten relationships. For though they were never yet apprehended, they were at one time seen, and imagination can see them again." And just to finish, this is a bit of a plug to my own research, but I want to make a very brief comment about wider connections that Barfield has to other areas of research. So one thing I'm exploring is, maybe you're familiar with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which comes from anthropology, but is very well known in linguistics as well, which is this idea that different languages will lead us to see the world in different ways. So if I speak English, I will see the world in a particular way, but if I speak Nahuatl, for example, I will see the world in a very different way. And this can be tested experimentally in cognitive science, and it's actually done in this way. And I perceive this very interesting connection between Sapir-Whorf and Barfield. What Barfield does is to go back to the origins of literature, of myth, and tells us that we find a very different worldview in those myths. And Sapir and Whorf are telling us that if we go to languages very different from European languages, Indo-European languages, we can find very different ways of looking at the world. And they do this in a synchronic way, so languages that exist today, whereas Barfield does this in a diachronic way. He goes back to ancient languages and ancient myth. So just to summarize, the value of ancient myth, like I said, would be this preservation of an ancient view of the world as a unitary experience that we can recover now through modern myth, through creation, through imagination and myth-making. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think now we have a few minutes. I know we are technically over time because we are scheduled to begin with the next panel now, but because we have more time in this next panel due to those two panelists not being able to come, I think we have quite a few minutes, if you like, to ask any questions, make any comments. Oh, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for these two presentations. I'm going to ask something to Ulysses, because I'm impressed by your presentation. I really like it. And as we have many students today here, I would like you to ask something very specific. You have been talking about that relationship between the metaphor and the reality, just taking things for granted and for real. And just to bring theories into modern life, into daily life, my question is just taking into account probably two of the most important books that we can read nowadays, which are the Quran and the Bible. Right? Can you discuss, I know it's a tricky question, but can we discuss something about this relationship of taking things for real, taking metaphors for real or not, or their interpretation of myth in religion, and possible risks we can find or whatever? Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question. I mean, it's a massive question, but I'll try to maybe say something along the lines of what Barfield would say, trying to represent Barfield's view here. I think Barfield would say, if you read poetry, if you read myths, ancient myths, you will realize that many of your categories that you have as a Western person living in Europe in the 21st century don't actually work so well, right? And this includes our scientific categories. Barfield was very interested in how science relates to religion and also to other myths and other religions as well, mythologies. So my first answer would be to say that poetry and myth allow us to contextualize our own position, which we sometimes take for granted, and this is true in anthropology, for example. We take for granted that a point of view, which is a scientific point of view, we want to say, is the correct standard to measure other worldviews and other belief systems, right? And this contextualization that we can achieve through poetry and myth is necessary to be able to step outside of our own point of view, because we sometimes lack that ability. I'm thinking of anthropology because this is a very heated debate in anthropology. Which standards do we use to actually go to other cultures and then explain those cultures away, right? So when it comes to religion, to the Quran or to the Bible, there's a very strong potential, I would say, there as well to shift those categories through this understanding of myth concretely. So what Barfield actually wanted to do, and he talks about this in Saving the Appearances, because he was a Christian, he was an Anglican, and very peculiar kind of Anglican, because he was very intellectually awake, as you can see. He was very interested in the main movements in his time. He wanted to rekindle the Christian imagination in a way that was credible to his own contemporaries. And he thought that the way to do this was to recover the value of imagination, and this is sounding very Inkling-like, because this is the basis of his idea, right, for the Inklings. And that to make aspects of the Hebrew Bible, for example, meaningful to us, we need to recover this use of the imagination as something that binds us again with reality and breaches this gap between the subjective and the objective, this divide, which Barfield considers the starting point and the problem. We see everything in terms of either it's objective and physical, material, is reduced, is described in the scientific explanation of the world, and is therefore empty of consciousness, is empty of emotion, or it's subjective and it's conscious and is therefore human, right? And we have this duality. So he wants to overcome that dualism, and to use myth is the first step in being able to make sense of these ancient texts like the Quran or the Bible, if that answers your question.
Okay. Okay. So I would like to thank you both for the presentations. They were very illustrative. I have taken a lot of notes, and I would like to ask for permission to Ulysses to email him about this last thing about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in anthropology, because my research goes kind of that way, and I would like to have more information about by other people that are not me, and I would like to ask for permission to contact you through the email and talk about it.
Of course, that's what's there, so you can use it and send me an email, anyone who wants to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you.